Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our ongoing Art and Thursday series here from the Chelmsford Public Library. If it's your first time here, you're in for a real treat. And if you're returning to the program, you already know, and we're really glad to have you back. As usual, we are thrilled to welcome Jane Oneail back to our virtual space for another amazing presentation. Jane is a sought-after speaker, educator, and independent art historian. Jane curates and delivers engaging art appreciation programs through her company, Culturally Curious, founded in 2017. She holds a master's degree in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. Thank you for being here, Jane, and thank you all for coming. Jane, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about these incredible women artists that are sure to inspire you. I am just delighted and honored that you would spend this next hour with me. So, this is officially part three of Fierce Females. If you haven't seen the earlier iterations, I'm sure they are available somewhere on YouTube, but if you're desperate to see them, get in touch with me and I can probably find a good link for you. Don't fret if you haven't seen the earlier installations. We are going to get started with like a little quick review. But I'm so happy to have this image on the screen to start us off because it's an image that I think the more you look at it, the longer you look at it, the more you delight in it. And I just love these bold gestural brushstrokes that this woman uses in her self portrait. We'll be getting back to it along the way, but I wanted to start off with a couple of big ideas before I introduce you to a whole new slate of fierce female artists. So, we're going to get started the way we typically do, considering the difference in the way that men and women have historically been portrayed in the history of art. And this is, of course, a broad brushstrokes generalization here. But I have these two images on the screen, and if we were all in the same room right now, we would probably have a field day sort of taking apart the varied ways that these images are so different and create such a contrast with each other. But by this point, you've probably noticed that the man in the image on the left is in a power pose, right? He's got the hand on the hip, the other hand in the jacket. He's got a sword. He's got a scroll here. He's got a medal. He looks like a person of consequence. And our female figure over here on the right is kind of melting. She's sort of collapsing into this pose. She seems unaware of our presence as viewers, and her clothes seem to kind of be sliding off of her. The colors create such a strong contrast to very vivid greens and this crisp black ensemble that he has versus all of these pale colors. She is practically as sleepy as the dog at her feet, and she seems to be sort of distracted by ideas of love, as suggested by this print behind her head. So, the big idea here, of course, is that men and women have historically been portrayed so different, and oftentimes women are portrayed not just as a subject but as an object for us to gaze upon. They are beautiful, sometimes alluring, and the reason this is a historical truth is that for centuries it was only men being prepared to become professional artists. So here is an expansive artist studio right around the year 1800. And we can see no women there, right? It's all young men preparing to become the great artists of their day. And they're doing the sculptures, they're doing the drawings and the paintings, they're interested in light and shadow. But the big issue here that would keep any young woman of any good standing out of a workshop like this is that they are using a nude model from which to study anatomy. So that was the reason given for this barrier for women participating in the arts. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Women have always been participating in the arts. Women oftentimes learned how to paint watercolors or paint floral botanicals. And yes, this was oftentimes thought of as like a woman's finishing. They'd go to finishing school to learn how to do this. But that was to round out their personality, to make them a more a better catch when searching for a husband. It wasn't to prepare them to become a professional artist. There are rare instances of this happening, of course, over the years. And this image here, this arresting image, it's absolutely gorgeous, isn't it? It's one of these rare images where we see a young woman who is in training to become a professional artist. And it's sort of a famous picture because for probably more than 150 years, people attributed this work to a great painter of the day, a male painter of the day. But through some very careful research and actually some study of architecture here, it was determined that this young woman here, who has her portfolio, using it as like a drawing pad here, and who's looking very carefully at us, that she was actually portrayed by another woman artist. And this was determined because they are apparently sitting in a wing of the Louvre where that sort of specific training was happening, women training other women in the arts. So our subject here, her name is Charlotte Duval d'Augnes. She was painted in 1801. She's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And she is carefully considering not a mirror, but another woman artist. And you can only imagine what was going through their heads at this time in their lives as they aspire to great things, but know that there's plenty of things in their future that would derail them from an actual career. And I think that did in fact happen for the young artist that we're looking at here, becoming a wife and a mother and such. Okay, so if we consider historically these barriers, I think we can approach this next image here with a little bit of irreverent humor. This is a poster from the Guerrilla Girls, who are an anonymous collective of artists and art historians. They call themselves the conscience of the art world, and they like to point out the inequality that exists in the art world. So here is a sort of tongue-in-cheek poster, the advantages of being a woman artist, working without the pressure of success. I particularly love knowing your career might pick up after you're 80. Of course, all of these advantages are disadvantages, right? And women have faced an uphill battle in terms of breaking into the field of fine arts for more than a century, much longer, really. So so let's return now to, as we always do, to our definition of fierce, our kind of working definition of fierce that will guide us through all of these introductions to women artists over the course of the evening. Because all we can do is kind of zero in on what makes them fierce. We could spend years talking about each one of these individual artists, but for tonight, it's just what makes them fierce. And our working definition is women who defied expectations and pushed beyond the boundaries of what was considered appropriate, acceptable, or desirable for their time. And I have an image here from a very fierce female. That would be Faith Ringgold. I believe I featured her last year when we were looking at fierce females. And this is one of her paintings from 1967 called The Flag is Burning. Faith Ringgold was very aware of race relations in the 1960s. She saw all of these race riots and she felt like they weren't being addressed. And she had her own sort of novel approach to realism. And so she wanted to integrate that into painting. In this painting, she has assembled a Black man, a white woman, and a white man. They're linking arms, they are connected, but their actual relationship is very ambiguous. They are standing behind this kind of translucent American flag that is, in fact, bleeding. And the Black man here is also bleeding. He's got a knife in one hand, and it seems as though he has a wound over his heart. His other hand covers his heart as though he's pledging allegiance to that flag, certainly pointing out the very thorny elements of being Black in America, particularly during the 1960s. You could probably make the case that it's still true today. So, although Faith Ringgold doesn't give us an answer or a solution really to these troubling relationships. She, I think, has very smartly pulled these figures together under the guise of the American flag to get us thinking about not just the nature of these relationships as Americans, but but the nature of race relations in general. So here is Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold, just a few years after painting The Flag is Bleeding, she and two male colleagues here decided to stage an exhibition in New York City at the Judson Memorial Church. These three would soon become known as the Judson Three because the exhibition that they staged was all about using the American flag in works of art. This was clearly something that Faith Ringgold was already passionate about. And it was sort of a zeitgeist moment too, because a gallerist had a case in front of the Supreme Court of the United States because he was being prosecuted for representing an artist who used the flag in works of art. This was a free speech case, sort of cut and dry, I think, to our modern eyes, but this was something that Faith Ringgold was fighting for. She and her male colleagues here were all arrested for staging this exhibition, and they came to be known as the Judson Three. They were quickly released. It was a case that I think the ACLU took up. And because she was so fierce, Faith Ringgold made a flag painting in response to it. She has overlaid the letters Judson and then the number three, referencing this particular event. And she's altered the American flag just enough. Changing the colors here to reference the Pan African flag. So she was definitely pushing boundaries all along the way, certainly qualifies as a fierce female. Now, let me give you a sense in terms of the artists that we will be looking at today. We've got a nice long list and a wide variety here from the Dutch Baroque all the way up to today. If you're familiar with all of my programs, maybe you've seen a few of these artists before. There's definitely some new ones here, and we'll be considering all of them in new ways, I think. I love this last image that we have on the screen here. This is another artist that we considered, I think, 1 year ago. This is Sofonisba Anguissola, who was the first internationally renowned woman artist working in the 1500s. And this is her self-portrait, if you can believe it. What a strange way to paint a self-portrait. She is a painted picture on an easel, but it looks as though a man is painting the picture. This was, in fact, her master, her teacher, who is depicted here as painting this beautiful painting. So, is she trying to add esteem to the portrait itself by saying that maybe somebody who has a better reputation painted it, or is she trying to sort of outclass him in this moment by essentially elucidating the fact that she can go beyond his talents here? Either way, it seems pretty fierce, doesn't it? All right, so let's start off with a smile. This is Judith Leister here, and she was an incredibly important Dutch Baroque artist. So this is the golden age, the Dutch golden age. This is when the arts were proliferating in the Netherlands, when there was a high demand from a sort of newly wealthy middle class for all kinds of joyful images. And we get a sense of that joy in Judith Leister's self-portrait here from 1630. So she was a very young woman when she painted this self-portrait. This is at the National Gallery of Art. She is relaxed, she's informal. There's a wonderful sense of spontaneity to this picture. It's as though we've just walked into the room and she's just suddenly aware of our presence and turns away from her easel where she's working and smiles at us. It's so warm, isn't it? She is also reinforcing the most important part of her identity, which is she is a professional woman artist. And here she is, such a young woman. I do struggle to believe that she actually painted with that giant starched lace collar on, but I've seen stranger things. So Judith Leister, she was a part of the Professional Guild of Artists. She was one of the first few women artists at this time to be accepted into that guild. And she was so successful and really apparently a very smart businesswoman that she actually developed not just a signature, but kind of a brand for her paintings. She combined her initials, J and L, with the shape of this star here, because Leicester sort of translates to like leading star or lodestar. So brings it all together and has this pretty modern way of marking her work. And notice in this example over here, this painting that she did called the Jolly Topper, there is all of this negative space here, and that is where she put her brand and her logo. She seemed to have a good sense that that would add value to her pictures. I mean, what a smart lady. During this time, she is going toe to toe with her male peers. She's successful. She actually sued one of the most prominent artists of the day for poaching a few of her male students from her. So she is in the thick of it. Now, then Judith Leister goes and gets married. She actually married another professional artist, somebody named Jan Molinar. This is an example of his work on the right, her work on the left. When they married, she was the more successful artist, and we can see here that their works sort of seem to be in dialogue to a certain extent. Both of these works, when I look at them, seem like they are built up around a protagonist, a seated protagonist that is looking out at us. And then from there, Leicester and Molinar sort of create these wonderful little compositions about people cheating at cards, which is always a very fun subject in the history of art. Now, unfortunately, for Judith Leister at least, who did keep her maiden name as her professional name, unfortunately, after she got married, she went on to have 5 children, and that completely took her away from her work as an artist. Here and there, she would paint some, like, floral still lifes, like the ones that we see. She was Dutch, so there has to be a couple tulips in there, right? And it's posited that she might have helped her husband with some of his paintings because his paintings would go on to become much more complex. But sadly, her sort of retreat from the art world meant that her reputation really sort of dwindled, and nobody was really aware of her artistic contributions. So much so that after she and her husband passed away, most of her artwork was attributed to her husband. And over the years, unfortunately, that little logo that she's so well known for was actually painted over by various unscrupulous art dealers with new signatures by male artists added to her work. So this sweet painting here called the Happy Couple or the Carousing Couple is in the collection of the Louvre, and it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that they actually realized it was a Judith Leister painting. They bought it as a Franz Hals painting. Actually, that was that same artist that she sued for poaching her students. So in the end, she was creating these great images, but they were being passed off as her male contemporaries. Now, I will leave you with this one last self-portrait from Judith Leister. This was discovered in an English country home just a few years ago, painted about 25 years after that first self-portrait. And we can see a woman who has changed, a woman who has given birth to 5 children and raised them and set aside her own professional inclinations in order to be a mother. But here she is once again holding her brush and looking out at us directly. There isn't the sort of weightlessness in that easy joy that we see in the first self-portrait, but a woman who seems so sure of herself over here on the right. For being an early pioneer, for being so seemingly smart about the business side of her work too, with that little branding, I think Judith Leister definitely qualifies as fierce. We're going to move ahead in time to the 19th century. We're going to move over to France now. This is that image that we started with, that beautiful self-portrait by the artist Berthe Morisot. She was a part of the French Impressionist movement in the second half of the 19th century. I love this self-portrait. It was painted when she was in her mid-40s. And like I said, these really sort of confident brushstrokes, the really energetic brushstrokes. I particularly love this kind of tornado effect down here. You sort of get the sense that she's like mixing up her paints and then sort of almost attacking the canvas, but you get that sense of movement there. It's just so wonderful. Now, most people don't know Bert Morisot through a self-portrait like this. She's probably better known as the subject of some of her contemporaries' paintings, namely that of Edward Manet, who's like the most famous proto-French impressionist. He was kind of taken by her beauty. He painted her in the balcony over here and then several portraits. He painted her more than any other woman in his career. So you might be thinking, ooh, is there a little spark there, a little love connection? Who's to say? But we do know that Manet was already spoken for. So Berthe Morisot did the next best thing. She married Edward Manet's brother. And this is a portrait that she did, well, a picture that she did of him while they were on their honeymoon in England. You think about it, this is a really strange painting for your honeymoon because he's looking away from her and he's actually looking at another woman. But these French Impressionist artists, they really loved this sort of game of like who is looking at who and the spectacle of being out in public at this time. We can see here though that Bert Morisot's painting is alive with these really sort of energetic, vibrant brushstrokes. Here she's painted these translucent curtains, just giving us a sense of what's beyond them. I love the flowers in the windowsill. Now, I should mention, she was a part of the French Impressionist movement, and it's not an overstatement to say that she was a leader of this movement. She helped to shape our entire understanding of what French Impressionism is. She participated in 7 out of the 8 French Impressionist exhibitions, but believe it or not, because she was a woman, she actually had to get permission from her mother to participate. This is a painting that she did of her mother and her sister, and the artist Edgar Degas actually had to write to her mother and basically beg her and say, "Please, please, please let your daughter exhibit her works with us." So this is another sort of an earlier picture. You can see that her brushwork isn't quite as loose here, but there's another kind of astonishing story that goes along with this picture. Berthe Morisot was getting ready to submit this work for exhibition, and she wanted to get a little bit of insight from her brother-in-law, Edward Manet, the famous proto-French impressionist. She called him over and she thought he would just give her a couple of pointers, when in fact he picked up a paintbrush and started altering her painting. Not just any part either, it's the actual image of her own mother. And I have to say, I don't know of any other instance where male artists altered each other's work in this way. In 1890, Morisot wrote in a notebook that she really struggled to be taken seriously as a woman. She said, "I don't think there's ever been a man who treated a woman as an equal, and that's all I would have asked for I know I'm worth as much as they." Now, Morisot also, got married. Well, we know she got married. She also had a daughter. So, like Leicester, she's kind of juggling everything, trying to negotiate a marriage and a family and being a professional woman. And she did that by hiring help. And what we are looking at here are 2 images of other women taking care of her daughter, Julie, including a wet nurse who's actually feeding her daughter. And these are kind of unprecedented images in the history of art. 2 professional women seeing each other in this moment, recognizing what it takes for a woman to, carve out a career as a professional woman artist. So here we sort of see the sacrifices that she had to make too, in order to find some semblance of balance here. So towards the end of her career really is when Morisot's brushwork gets so light and gets so energetic, and I always think it almost seems like effusive. We can see how she has like this evolving sense of even what is a finished picture. In both of these works, she doesn't care to like extend her brushwork all the way to the corners of her paintings. Now, when her male contemporaries' works were exhibited, critics would praise them for their creative vigor and their vision, right? But when Morisot's work, like these works, were exhibited, critics would talk about their feminine charm. So no matter what she did, she was always considered sort of one step behind her male peers just by virtue of her gender. but for being a woman who figured out how to balance life, marriage, children, with being a professional woman in the arts, Morisot definitely qualifies as fierce. Okay. Our next fierce female is a Swedish artist named Hilma af Klint. And we can see that she was born right around mid 19th century and lived up almost through the end of World War II. We are looking at an undated self portrait of hers. And here she seems so contemplative. We don't get all of that same kind of gusto and energy that we got with the Bert Morisot self portraits. Here is a photograph of young Hilma af Klint and an example of her early work. She had sort of a launch into the art world that was pretty standard, although it was still pretty unusual for women to be going into this field. But she had formal training in the arts. She attended the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Stockholm. She graduated, I think, with honor. She was one of the very few women to be in attendance, though. And when she finished, her family thought that she would become a commercial artist, and she began producing landscapes like the one that we see over here. This one's from 1903. It's a pretty standard landscape. It's nice, but maybe not one that would, blow your hair back. so. Hilma af Klint did not go on to have a traditional life in any way. She did not get married. She did not have children. Instead, she surrounded herself with four close friends, and the five of them became known as the Five. They would spend a lot of time in this room right here together, essentially leading seances. They were very interested in religion and theosophy, and they would connect with spirit guides and go into a trance like mode where they started doing automatic drawing. Unconscious drawing. This is something that we could all do without going into a trance per se, but just kind of let your hand move, like put a pencil in your hand and let your hand move over the top of a piece of paper. And it produced these very pleasing abstract works. This is not the only one, but these are examples. Here's a whole installation here of some of the work that the Five were producing in these early years of the 1900s. And I want to stress to you that this was kind of revolutionary for its time. Sure, they got to this solution here by sort of an unexpected medium, or by an unexpected passage, really. But what we see here predates any pure abstraction that any male artist produced in the 20th century. And they were doing this without any sort of fanfare. They weren't really exhibiting this work. This was all part of like their spiritual practice. But nobody in the world was producing art that looked like this up until this moment. And things only were just getting started for Aft Klimt. So what she got a particular message from a spirit guide who instructed her on this project that she began to call the Great Work. The Great Work would end up being 193 paintings. Most of them were egg tempera paintings, and they were all a part of this this understanding of her religious beliefs. So it kind of starts off with this notion of like chaos, primordial chaos. There's a nice color palette for this sort of sub-series in the Great Work where we see a lot of yellows and blues. We get the sense of maybe a little bit more of those like automatic gestural marks on in the image on the right. Over here on the left, it's really hard to know what we're looking at, right? Is this something in the sky? Is it something in the water? Is it living? Is it moving? There are elements here like the W and the U, which for Afklimt referenced men and women. She was very interested in dualities and the way men and women come together, which is kind of intriguing considering that she never got married. So here is the Chaos series all together, and you can see that the colors again they're so pleasing as an assemblage of pictures. They work very well together. But she was just getting going. Like I said, there's 193 of these paintings. There's a subset called the largest 10. Her spirit guide at one point told her to instructed her to make these huge tempera paintings, roughly 10 feet tall by 7 feet across, and to complete these 10 works in 40 days. Now, we're just looking at 3 of them, obviously. We can see they're on a grand scale. We can see they're really innovative compositions, and we can see that they are essentially pure abstractions, although we can see some letters over here as well. So, like I said, there was nobody else making anything like this, and she was able to do it in 40 days. I think she had a little bit of help too. Here's another installation scene where you can see a few more of these pictures from the greatest work. They all relate to each other really nicely too in terms of their color palettes. And this is a woman who is sort of like unbound from all of the rules that existed in the history of art up until then. So, like I said, these were revolutionary for the time, but they were not really out there in the art world for other people to see or respond to with their own art. Here's just a couple more images from the great work. She did a whole subset on swans, interested in the duality of like the white swan, the black swan here, and we can see that their beaks are touching and the tip of their wings are touching. We have those complementary colors of the blue and the yellow here that she loves so much. And over the course of time, these swans begin to transform in her works. They become more interconnected and then they become pure geometric abstraction. These are such startling and surprising works to evolve from something that was originally so grounded in realism. But we can see how she can take an idea and transform it into abstraction very effectively. Now, she was creating all of these works as part of the great work, which took about a decade to finish, um, for a plan for a temple. Her spirit guide told her that all of these works would one day be in like a house of worship. And she even had a little diagram for that temple. It was going to be like a spiral. And I remember when I first read about that, I got really excited. I was like, a spiral, like the Guggenheim Museum, Frank Lloyd Wright. But the temple that she imagined was going to be a different kind of spiral. These 3 works were, she called them altarpieces. So they were going to be at the center of that spiral. They were the most sacred works that she was creating. And we can see that they're very large in terms of scale, and they have gold in them, which signifies their importance in this series. We get a little bit of that duality with these gold spheres seemingly transmitting messages down and messages going up towards that gold sphere too. So this sort of sense of an interplay of information with a heavenly realm. This the duality of the relationship between humans and the divine here. So really interesting images, but also just visually impressive too. I particularly love this rainbow within the triangle and the colors that she's using around this golden sphere here. I mean, these are powerful works, they're intriguing works. So when she was done her great work after about a decade, she stopped getting divine communication, any sort of instruction on what she should do, but that didn't change the way she felt about religion. And she continued painting, and oftentimes her paintings from that point forward were more like research. There was still a great deal of abstraction, and eventually she kind of went on to wet on wet watercolor, sort of loosely inspired by some botanicals. Now, when Af Klimt passed away in 1944, her will stated that none of her works could be exhibited publicly for at least 20 years. And it was her nephew who inherited all of these works, and he did abide by that. But when the world eventually saw these paintings, they were astonished by her by her innovation, especially considering it was essentially done in isolation. Just a few years ago, I think it was 2018, these works were on view at the Guggenheim in New York City. It's like that spiral temple, right? And it actually, this exhibition of her work actually broke museum records in terms of attendance. So it seems like the world already sort of knows that Hilma af Klint was a revolutionary who was doing and creating purely abstract works before any male contemporary had arrived at a similar solution. So for being a trailblazer, she definitely qualifies as fierce. Now, grab your grab your tissues because I'm going to introduce you to Kate Kolowitz. And we see her here in a self-portrait. She lived at roughly the same time as Hilma af Klint, but her paintings are or her print work, I should say, are really a world away. Af Klimt was in this heavenly realm, and Kate Kolowitz was firmly grounded in what was happening on Earth. So she is probably best known for her interest in the plight of the working poor. A little bit of background information on Kita Kolowitz. From a young age, she showed an interest in the arts, and her family really encouraged it. So much so that when a doctor proposed to her at age 18, her family was kind of like, "Oh, won't that sort of set you back as an artist?" But in the end, she did get married, and she had two sons. And in fact, her husband's medical practice helped to inform a lot of her work. But she was somebody who came from a religious background and sort of a socialist background. So she was always sort of oriented towards the lives of the working poor. So after seeing a play about some workers who protested, she was inspired to do a series on that same subject. So this is called The Weavers' Strike. This was done in the 1890s, and this is the very first image from that series. And it's simply called Need. What we're seeing is this shadowy room where a woman is hunched over a tiny child who's lying down. Is he sick? Has he died? We don't know, but we understand the need. Now, Kolowitz was inspired to create this work because of that play that she saw, which specifically referenced an actual weavers' strike from about 50 years earlier, where in this Prussian controlled part of Europe, in like a weaving manufacturing center, the weavers' wages were being slowly and systematically diminished. They were living on next to nothing. And the need here is expressed in the ultimate terms. It's a life or death need now. So, just a couple images later in the same series, she creates this work which she calls the conspirators. What do you do when you're losing everything? You meet in shadowy places and you start making plans. You start thinking about what are your options. And these conspirators are thinking uprising. Now, this is astonishing because uprisings are not a traditional subject in the history of art. I mean, typically art is commissioned by people who do not want poor people rising up against them. It's commissioned by the rich. But she's producing these images motivated by her own passions, her own goals here. So what do the conspirators do? They start marching. They start marching towards the home of their employer. And over here on the left, we can see them processing a woman with a child in tow. These gaunt, emaciated weavers. Some of them seem to be shouting or maybe chanting on the way there. And then they get to the gates of the home of their employer, this elaborate ironwork. It's a gate that they're never going to get through, but they are picking up cobblestones and getting ready for a fight. And again, that child is there. This is life or death to these weavers. The final scene in this series is people, weavers who have been killed in the fight, being brought back to the weaving room, and their bodies are being laid on the floor. And we can see people collapsed in grief, and another woman standing here overlooking the body of someone who she maybe knew and loved. We can see that there's smoke still in the air. The battle is probably still waging, but we get the sense that there's no way for the weavers to win this one. Now, this is a woman who so connected, so resonated with the plight of the working poor. She once famously said, "I'm not interested in the bourgeoisie at all." She's like, they don't, they're not interesting. but the proletariat, they have guts and they are beautiful. They will always be beautiful to me. Now, I mentioned before she married a doctor, and that does impact her work. He served some of the poorest communities in Berlin, and so she was sort of constantly bombarded with the idea of poor people who were losing their family members, losing their children because of lack of resources. And so, in the early years of the 20th century, Kollwitz was inspired to create this very dramatic image, this very striking image. And it's called simply Woman with Dead Child from 1903. This is her. This is her son. Her son modeled for her. He didn't actually die, but Kollwitz is imagining his death here and is feeling it to her core. She has collapsed to the floor in this kind of awkward position so as to support his little body, and his head falls back and she is burrowing her face in his chest. Her features are transformed into something that looks more like an animal, and we can feel, we can smell, we can sense this desperation to hold on to that little life. Um, you don't have to be a parent to feel every ounce of the emotion in this image. And unfortunately, it seemed to foretell what would happen to this little boy, because just a few years later, when World War One breaks out, he's a young, idealistic kid and he enlists, and um, almost instantly he dies, as does his entire battalion. It's just wiped out. It's completely senseless. And it took her more than a decade to figure out how to respond to that loss with her art, but she ultimately created these sculptures of grieving parents, which are actually in the cemetery where her son was buried. And these are some of the most profoundly moving objects of art I've ever seen. Both of these parents on their knees, their eyes closed. The father is upright, erect. He seems to be holding himself together, sort of buttressing himself, making himself stronger. And the mother is hunched over, her arms crossed across her chest. It's as though she's still trying to hug that little body again. And and her face is pointed towards the ground. Here's just another view of the installation of those works, looking out over the graves of all of those young men that were lost way too soon. Kollwitz only went to the cemetery once after these works were installed, and she went to this sculpture, which used her own face. It's a self portrait, and with tears streaming down her own cheeks, she caressed the face of that grieving mother, and it's so terribly tragic to think about what was in her heart at that time. So she dedicated much of her art going forward to the idea of stopping future wars. This is part of a series that she did in the 1920s, and this work is simply called The Mothers. And what we see here is another print. This is, I think this is a lino cut or woodcut, and it's this tight sculptural mass of these women who are huddled together, wrapping their arms around each other, but they don't find comfort in that because they are all looking out over each other's shoulders, anxious and nervous about what is out there in the world. And as you spend more time with this, you realize that they are protecting the heads of their little babies in their arms. They are part of that huddle, and their children are there too. The older children are peeking out from behind their dresses, and you can see and feel the desperation to protect the children. Oh, Kate Kollwitz was a fierce female because she advocated for the poor, and she told the stories of all of the grieving families that lost people in both World War One and World War Two. Her works just rip your heart out, but they are some of the most moving and some of the most powerful works I've ever seen. All right, we're going to move on to a very different artist now. Lighten things up just a little bit. I'd like to introduce you to Joan Mitchell, not to be confused with Joni Mitchell. There's no music here, but there is dancing. There is ice dancing. There's ice skating at least. Joan Mitchell came from a very affluent background and had like the best education and this wonderful privileged upbringing, which included a lot of travel and competitive ice skating. So here she is as a young woman. And I just think that this picture is amazing because it foretells who she will become in this next image. She's athletic, broad gestures, right? She's competitive. That's going to be a big part of who she becomes. And I do think that maybe there was something about looking at all of those lines etched into the ice that maybe gave her a little bit of inspiration for the kind of abstraction that she would do later on. So Joan Mitchell came to the solution of abstract expressionism when it was kind of coming to a head in New York City right around 1950. Now, she'd been living abroad, she comes back, and in 1950, she creates this picture called Figure in the City. And of course, we can sort of clearly make out the outline of a figure here, and then this kind of cubist city behind her. This would be the very last time that she ever paints a figure. It's like her swan song, it's a goodbye, because from that point forward, she completely devotes herself to abstraction and abstract expressionism specifically. So the following year, she creates this untitled work. She's living in New York City where there is this collegial group of abstract expressionist artists, and they are all men. They are heavy drinkers, and there's a lot of ego involved there. And she kind of elbows her way into this group, and she drinks with them, and she's making work that is every bit as good as theirs. But the press in general sort of latched on to this idea of these macho men making action painting, that her story kind of fell by the wayside to a certain extent. With a work like this, we can see that she is doing all over painting. Jackson Pollock had also done work similar to this, and initially people had sort of derided it as like, wallpaper. When I look at this one, I'm reading too much into it, I know, but I almost get the sense of like all of those artists sitting around talking about art, debating their ideas. Like you see maybe even like somebody's shoulders here, the lapel of a jacket. I get the sense that these are the abstract expressionist artists, and this is her finding her way into this movement. Now, she finds her own mode of expression very quickly, too. By 1955, she has created this work called The City, which is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I really love this painting. We can see that she's moved away from all over painting. A lot of her works have kind of like a mass of these gestural brushstrokes. And when I look at this painting, my first impression is not city, but brain. And you get the sense of like all of these neural networks here. But then that makes sense if you think of it as a metaphor for a city, and like the electrical wires and the plumbing and the sidewalks, and how everybody who's living in a city is connected to everybody else. You spend a little bit more time with this, and you begin to see what looks like a brain is like this pink mass here. It has all of these other beautiful colors in it, and all of these other kinds of marks. I mean, there's a lot of dripping here as well. So Joan Mitchell once famously referred to her paintings as memories of landscapes that she carries with her. And so it's probably not correct to think of all of them as landscapes, but it's kind of fun to think of them that way. This Joan Mitchell is here in Manchester, New Hampshire, at my hometown art museum, the Currier Museum. And sometimes by the 1960s, when this was painted, Joan Mitchell would give her works kind of fanciful titles. This one she called Couscous, which doesn't necessarily help us understand the picture at all. But by this point, we see almost like violent art, mark making. She's using like palette knives. She's flinging paint. We can see it sort of spattering here. It's dripping. I mean, she's using everything in her tool belt. And it almost feels like it was a frenzy to create something like this. But believe it or not, it was just the opposite. Joan Mitchell was incredibly measured in her work. She would like make one mark and then walk back across the room and sit down and think about these works and then approach it again. So what seems like this wild frenzy here was just the opposite. It was a careful consideration in terms of color and balance and the suggestion of maybe a place here. Is this a lake? Is this the shadow? It's fun to sort of think about it. Now, towards the end of her life, she moved to France permanently. She actually lived on the same property that Monet had once lived on. And I think she was just inspired by the light and inspired by the beauty there. And she sort of gave herself over to making beautiful works that were inspired by French artists. So we have an example of Joan Mitchell's work here on the left and Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers, which served as an inspiration for it. So in the end, Joan Mitchell, I think, outlived all of the other abstract expressionists, and was tough enough to hold her own spot in this incredibly competitive and tough field where women were not initially or ever maybe truly accepted. So for holding her own, she definitely qualifies as fierce. Now, if you've seen some of my other programs, you might remember the name Ana Mendieta. She definitely deserves a place in sort of this catalog of fierce women. She was born in Cuba and she came to the United States as a political refugee as a very young teenager. She was separated from her parents, lived in like foster homes, attended reform schools. Nobody really knew what to do with her. But she did end up attending the University of Iowa, and she eventually got a master's in fine arts while she was there. Now, something happened to her while she was there, too. Something happened that profoundly affected her, I should say. There was a fellow classmate that was raped and murdered while Ana Mendieta was a student there. And from that point forward, you can tell there is a consciousness about women and violence in her work. There is also an interest in using blood as a mode of expression, which is kind of wild and barrier breaking for the time. This was probably the mid 1970s, the early 1970s. So we see her here surrounded by male colleagues. This is an example of some of the student work that she did. We can see her picking up the clippings from a fellow student who shaved his beard, and then she would apply those clippings to her own face. Here she is, this beautiful young woman, and she's using her body, her face, as her canvas. She's modifying her own appearance, definitely pushing beyond the boundaries of what we consider desirable or acceptable to have us think about this organic material in a different way and to have us think about young women in a different way. It's sort of a bold work and I love it. She goes on to move to New York City and she's probably best known for a series that she did called the Silhouette series. And she described this work where she would lie down and her silhouette would be outlined in various landscapes using fire and water and blood and frozen water, and sometimes just dirt, and sometimes flowers are added. But it was an attempt to reconnect with the land, and it was an attempt to repair that dislocation that she felt from being a teenager pulled away from her family. Um, in her artist statement, she said, I've been carrying out a dialogue between the landscape and the female body based on my own silhouette. I believe this has been a direct result of having been torn from my homeland during adolescence. I am overwhelmed by the feeling of having been cast from the womb, which she describes as being nature. My art is my way I reestablish the bonds that unite me to the universe. It's a return to the maternal source. So she's doing this at a time when there are plenty of other artists that are using the earth as their canvas. This probably the most famous example, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. Ana Mendieta always kept her work personal. It's about her body, it's about her experience. This is her lying in a Mexican grave with these flowers placed in her body, this notion of something living coming out of something that's dead, right? Now, tragically, her work seems to sort of sort of predict her demise as well, because after she moved to New York City, she married another artist and they had sort of a tumultuous, heavy drinking kind of relationship. And just 8 months after they were wed, Anna Medieta fell from their 34th story apartment window to her death. And everybody, well, no, almost everybody believes that it was her husband who pushed her. Notice too that the headline here says sculptor accused of pushing wife out the window to death. He's the artist, she's just the wife, right? Even though she was a professional artist in her own right. So he was eventually acquitted of this crime. He passed away, I think, within the past year or so. And really, right up until his death, this has haunted him and his reputation. And if you look back at her body of work and how sort of groundbreaking it is, how visceral it is, and how it does seem so connected to her ultimate demise, Anna Mendieta certainly qualifies as fierce. Now we have just a few minutes left. We're going to end on such a happy note tonight. You're going to love this. I'd like to introduce you to Amy Sherald. The name might be familiar because she was, of course, the artist that painted Michelle Obama's formal portrait. Um, Amy Sherald grew up in the South. She grew up in Columbus, Georgia. And even though she was in the South, she attended schools that were primarily with white children. She became very aware of her race and how she was being perceived from a young age. Now, we've talked about some of these artists who were encouraged in their work from a young age and others who were not. Unfortunately, Amy Sherald was not supported in her pursuit of the arts from a young age. Her family wanted her to go into medicine. In fact, her brother became a nurse. So she really had to kind of like fight to be a part of the art world. She actually waited tables until she was 38 years old, but she also got an advanced degree in fine arts as well. So there was another major setback when it came to Amy Sherald working her way into the world of professional fine arts. When she was just 39 years old, she had a heart transplant. She had gone to the doctor and discovered that her heart was functioning at just 5% capacity. She was one of these kind of like miracle people who did not have any symptoms. But you would think having a heart transplant would set you back some. Well, she actually painted this work the same year as the heart transplant. It's a very large painting where we see this regal looking Black woman. She's wearing like this diamond studded tiara or crown here. She's got the big, they sort of look like pearl earrings or costume jewelry, pearl necklace, beautiful navy blue dress here, purple sash, and then the long white gloves. She's set against this blood red background, and she's got the bright red lips to match. Now, everything about this woman screams sort of like respectable, upstanding. She looks like a person you'd be on your best behavior around. But Amy Sherald gave this work a very provocative title. She called it Welfare Queen, and of course is poking at this history in the United States of casting aspersions, particularly on Black women, as being some sort of drain on public finances for an over reliance or even an abuse of public assistance. All apparently dating back to this one woman in the 1970s who was actually mixed race, who did sort of famously abuse the public assistance programs. And then it just sort of became a part of our cultural consciousness. And we had politicians on both sides of the aisle referring to welfare queens. And usually that's a coded term to disparage Black women. And here's Amy Sherald saying, you want a welfare queen? I'm going to give you a queen instead. So this is sort of her finding her mode of expression when it comes to art. She really likes portraits and she really likes painting contemporary living Black people. And she wanted us as viewers to be able to connect with them really sort of immediately. So she always paints them gazing out directly at us. And also importantly, she decided to not paint their skin brown. For Amy Sherrill, just the fact of brown skin, she felt like was almost like a political statement, and it set up a barrier between you and the subject, and it prevented understanding. So she would, in fact, paint their skin in gray tones or grisaille to kind of eliminate that any sort of preconceived notion about who these subjects are, when of course we still know that they are Black. She would oftentimes put her subjects in kind of interesting type costumes and then set them up against a flat essentially like a flat plane of a bright color, the pink, the yellow here, with without really any shadow. So there's this nice kind of dreamlike quality to a lot of her pictures. Now, she was one of almost 3 dozen artists that were being considered to paint the portraits of the Obama. She was being considered for both President Obama and Mrs. Obama, and apparently she went to visit them in the White House to kind of have a final interview. And I don't know if she's just very smart, but she said to the president, you know, it would be an honor to paint your portrait, but I would be particularly interested in working with Mrs. Obama. And from there, they just sort of clicked. We can see the artist creating the work or working on it in her studio. And here we see the finished work here, where Mrs. Obama is presented in 3/4 profile in this huge maxi dress, this long dress that kind of goes outside of the frame here. She looks contemplative. Her one elbow is resting on one arm, her wrist is flexed, and her head is resting on that wrist. And of course, she's painted in grisaille, and we've got this beautiful kind of powder blue background here. So some art historians like to connect it to another very famous portrait of a woman from early 20th century, Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, who is also wearing a geometric pattern dress that seems to kind of flatten her out to a certain degree. And she's got kind of a similarly flexed wrist here as well. Now, when this painting was unveiled back in 2018, it created, you know, an uproar in many ways, and it made Amy Sherrill an instant celebrity who had to grow a pretty thick skin pretty quickly because two big criticisms came out. People thought it was a missed opportunity to not paint Mrs. Obama with Black skin. She was the first Black first lady, and that aspect of her identity seemed too important for a lot of people to leave out of the picture. To which Amy Sherrill essentially replied, "Some people like their poetry to rhyme, and some people don't. Either way, it's cool." Um, she the another major criticism of this work was that people felt like it just didn't look like Michelle Obama. I can leave that to you to decide. Here is a reference photo for the artist, and we can see. I think for my eye, at least, it looks very similar to the finished work. Now, this painting sort of took on a life of its own after it, along with Kehinde Wiley's portrait of the president, were installed at the National Portrait Gallery. I believe their attendance tripled during those early days, and then the works went on a famous like multi-city tour after that. But at the National Portrait Gallery, there was a little girl, about 4 years old, I think, who went to go and see this portrait, and this image of her looking up at Mrs. Obama hanging on the walls of the National Portrait Gallery, looking like a queen, literally leaves her with her mouth agape. It was um, it was a moment that I think reminded the world that everybody needs heroes to look up to. And so this little girl's mother actually wrote a book about the experience, and it's called Parker Looks Up, an Extraordinary Moment. It is such a sweet book. It is my daughter's favorite book right now. And even my daughter, she shares the awe. She's like, so she's a real person. And it's just so sweet. So this all worked out for Parker Curry very well. She actually got to meet Mrs. Obama, and she got her own version of the dress. I mean, could it be any better? So I would say for Amy Sherrill, our artist here, she qualifies as fierce for painting these powerful pictures of Black Americans and an iconic and uplifting image of the first Black First Lady. So, with that, a very, very quick conclusion. As I like to remind people, we've seen um, a wide variety of images tonight, and some of them were spiritual, some of them were beautiful, some of them are personal, some of them are painful, and they're all kind of incredible in their own right. And what I want us to take away, what I want us to remember is the fight behind each one of them, because each one of these fierce female artists had to fight for their place in the art world, and we should always honor that. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have about the fierce females we looked at. I will also go back to the slide that has all of their names on here too, if that's helpful to you in formulating any questions. All right, and I will start with the Q&A here. Let's see. Nancy says, what is the name of the artist in your program overview page? This is Sofanispa Anguissola. I will type that answer. Do my best to spell it right. Sofanispa Anguissola. If you're interested in her, there's a great example of her work at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Nancy Parker's here tonight. Hi, Nancy. She says, where is the cemetery with the grieving parents? Let me go back to my notes on that, Nancy. I'm pretty sure I have that. I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in Germany, but let me see if I have the exact location. Just a moment. Let's see. Oh, these are tough German words for me to try and pronounce. They were moved from the original location. Now they're in a larger cemetery in Vladslo, which I think is in Germany. It's Vladslo. Incredible work, wasn't it? And then Colleen said, did Michelle Obama like the painting of her? Great question, Colleen. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I think she, I think she did. Um, she and the artist Amy Sherrill, they had a rapport. They were pretty tight. So I think she was going to be an advocate for whatever was produced, but I don't know if she loved it. That's a really good question. And maybe somebody can get to the bottom of that as we're looking at these at these questions tonight. Great question, Colleen. I'm checking out the chat right now. I answered the cemetery question. And I'd love to see all these familiar names. Thank you, everybody, for coming every month. And I should mention too, next month, put it on your calendars, April 24th, we'll be looking at treasures from the Gardner Museum. I've always kind of danced around this, but I love the Gardner. When I was in grad school, I used to give tours of the Gardner, so I feel like I know it like the back of my hand. We're going to have a great time going through that museum. Um, let's see here. Um, Collar has drooped a bit. Just funny comments here. I won't read everything out loud, but I appreciate. Oh, and Chris says that Hilma F. Klimt's swans remind him Escher. I would agree. That's a great connection. Thanks for adding that. And let's see. Was F. Klimt able to sell her work? I don't think that was ever her intention, Ellen. I think she kind of kept it private. Interestingly, this was just in the news within the past week or so. I think it's her maybe great nephew, no, great grand nephew, who is now in charge of the foundation that manages her collection. And he is seriously thinking about pulling these works off you and only offering them up to sacred spaces, because for him, these are not works about, abstract art. They are, like spiritual tokens, basically. So he's kind of wrestling with what to do with them. And it looks like Lita might have seen that exhibition. Lisa asked, what medium did Kolowitz use? So the Weaver strike that we saw, those were lithographs. And I think you can probably see it most clearly in the conspirators slide here. Such a powerful image. So there's like a crayon that's kind of used in lithography. So it does kind of look like charcoal. But those were woodcuts that we saw a little bit later on with the mothers here. And Ellen, I hope you heard where that cemetery is, Vladslo. Vladslo. Um, Leslie, thanks for being here. Oh, Lisa says middle left, I see a skeletal face. I wonder if you're talking about this work. Let's see. Um, oh, Mary says she likes, oh, she's seeing figures in Joan's work. That's really interesting. And Mary Kirster's here. Mary, thanks for joining us. And you love the city too. Oh, yes, great minds think alike, Mary. Um, very Frida Kahlo. Oh, maybe somebody's talking about Ana Mendieta there. I see a lot of connections, especially, with applied facial hair in that case. There's an exhibition of Amy Sherald's work opening at the Whitney in April. Oh, let's rent a bus, all of us, and go down there. um, Thank you, Nancy Parker, for your kind words. Thank you, everybody, for very, very kind words. And I'm just delighted that people are feeling inspired by these incredible women. I know I was, but when it came to Kate Kolwitz, let me tell you, I was working on this at my dining room table, just like tears coming down my face because this work is just so incredibly powerful. Thank you, everybody. I'm looking at all of these, and I really, really, really appreciate it. Um, Maria asks, are my lecture notes available? I don't really have formal notes, but if you ever wanted more information about something or if I could help to fill in the gaps, please feel free to get in touch. You can always reach me on my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. Ron, thanks for your kind words. I always love it when a man steps up for the Fierce Females presentation. This year would be Joan Mitchell's 100th birthday anniversary. Very cool. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And oh, Lisa, thanks for adding in about Ninth Street Women. That's a great resource if you're interested a little bit more in Joan Mitchell and her contemporaries. I'm glad you're here too, Lisa. Thanks for being here. Faith Ringgold was your neighbor, Eve? Wow. She is one of my all-time favorites. Eve, send me an email and tell me more about Faith Ringgold. I'm all ears. Ellen said, how did Hilma support herself? Ellen, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, but now I'm intrigued and I'm going to write that down. Um, because there's no obvious answer to me on that one. Good question. Let's see here. Deborah says, will I be teaching a course somewhere? This is how I do it, just in this format, but I could think about maybe putting together something where we could meet via Zoom and it could be more like a class. Thank you, Frank Cronson, for being here. I always love to see your name. Um, oh, Mary's a member. Oh, at the Whitney. Yes, we should go see that together, Mary. That would be so much fun. All right. All right. Well, I think I got through all of these very kind comments. I really, really, really appreciate them. There might be more in the Q&A now. Were Anna Mendieta's pictures photographs? Yes, correct. They were not painted. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. She also asked, in the portrait of Sophie Spanguasola, does she have an extra hand? Let's go see. I love these questions. I might have missed that if that's the case. It might be the hand. What? Okay, I see what you're saying. This is weird. It seems like her hand would be going there, but it's down there. Okay, I missed that. I'm embarrassed, but that is weird. Or maybe there was going to be another person. That is a very strange detail. Um, you're all blowing my mind right now. Anonymous attendee, thank you for pointing that out. Um, Judith says she's on the bus to any museum we'd like to go to. Um, were the other members of the five also female artists? If you would, well, I don't think that the history I don't think that history has considered them in that way. They were doing these kind of automatic drawings along with Af Klimt. I don't know, and in fact, even in that array that I showed you before, I think those were works by the five and maybe not just F. Klimt. So they were doing all similar things maybe, but it doesn't seem like they took on more after this, from what I understand. Is there a book on Hilma af Klimt's art? I have several of them in the other room. I wish I could hold them up right now, but your local library will probably have at least a few of them, I'm sure, because my local library did. Um, is the male's hand, it is the male's hand that directs hers. I think that's I like that reading of it. There is this sense that, like, her hand is meeting his, and there's, like, a coming together there. I like that reading of it, Judith. Everybody, thank you so much for your kindness, for your interest, for your insight. You guys are always the best. I love these Thursday nights, and I look forward to next month when we're all together. Thank you so, 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 so much. Have a great evening, everybody. Enjoy the art, and I will see you soon. Take good care. Bye.